Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another brand new episode of the Word of the Day podcast. My name is Jamie Silva. I am your host, and I could not be more pleased to be back here behind the mic once again, pleasantly explaining another useful word to you all. Today's first word was suggested to us by alert listener Dave, who submitted it to us in handwritten form on a genuine piece of paper. It's very old school. We appreciate it. That word is the adjective arduous, which I actually do say on the regular. I use it to mean difficult and laborious, particularly in a physical sense, and usually in reference to a task or other strenuous endeavor. So, for example, one might say, "Boy howdy, peeling 20 pounds of potatoes sure is arduous work." Or perhaps, "Man, I did not expect that hanging this print of Pacific Northwest mushroom varieties would be so arduous. But the frame is heavier than you'd think, and the edges of the print just keep curling up on me. This is ridiculous." Now, folks, as you can imagine, this is a very useful word, because I'm sure all of you do all sorts of arduous things all the time, day in and day out, just working your fingers to the bone, and no one appreciates it. No one understands just how hard it is to do what you do. Except us. That's right. We here at the Word of the Day podcast, we get it. We appreciate you and all the arduous things that you do. Okay, so that's partly just flattery, which I hear is a good way to retain listeners, but it also reminds me of some advice I heard of through a friend named Toph, whose voice you can hear in episode 67 on the word gambit. This advice is about conversation and how to be better at it. So, whenever you're in a situation where you're being introduced to someone and getting acquainted, as part of the small talk, you'd probably both share what you do for a living, presuming you're both conventionally employed, of course. Well, whatever the other person says their job is, you should reply, "Wow, that sounds hard." Doesn't matter whether they're a professional chocolate eclair taster or a door-to-door door salesman. And I didn't stutter there, by the way. This is a door-to-door salesman who sells doors, which does sound tough. I mean, it's hard to argue that someone is lacking the very thing they opened to greet you. Anyway, no matter what they do, you just say, "Wow, that sounds hard." This simple statement will instantly ingratiate you to them, because basically everyone thinks their job is hard, and feels like others just don't get how exacting and demanding it is. And chances are they'll be so grateful that you appreciate it, and be delighted to tell you all about it. And this works even for people who enjoy their jobs just fine and aren't, serial gripers about the travails of employment. Like, take hosting this podcast. It's not even a job, it's just a hobby. I do it for fun. If it weren't fun, I wouldn't do it. But if someone said to me about it, "Wow, that sounds hard," I'd probably be like, "You know what? Yeah, it is hard. Absolutely. I gotta prep the shows and record the shows and edit the shows and deal with the whole staff, of course. It's exhausting." Well, now that you know today's word, you can tweak this clever, compassionate conversational gambit and tell people, "Wow, that sounds arduous." Briefly noting the etymology, this comes from the Latin arduus, which has almost the same sound and spelling, but meant high or steep, presumably referring to like cliffs or paths up mountains, which, sure, climbing up those does sound arduous. Oh, and by the way, speaking of the travails of working, as I just did, I'm going to go on a little tangent here. Travail, for those unaware, means, per Google, painful and laborious effort. Meanwhile, the French word for employment, or work, is travail, only pronounced travail. Thanks, automated Google pronunciation lady. And in the UK, if you want to refer to people who have jobs, you can say people who are in work. Okay, and stay with me here. We know that labor is another word for work, both as a verb, like laboring, and as a noun in economics jargon. There's the term labor force, meaning people who are able to work, or just the concept of labor itself, as opposed to, say, capital or technology. And a woman who is giving birth is said to be in labor. And another more archaic but still legit way to say a woman is in labor is to say she is in travail, which, remember, that is also the French word for work. So, is the woman giving birth here in work, or does that mean she's employed in the UK, or in the labor force, or all of those things at once? We're going in circles here. It's like a huge web of random linguistic connections. Language. So cool, am I right? Turning at last to the Google definition of arduous, it goes, quote, involving or requiring strenuous effort, difficult and tiring, unquote. Yeah, pretty much. And I should also toss in here the noun respite, which means, again from Google, quote, a short period of rest or relief from something difficult or unpleasant, unquote. You could just think of it as a rest. This word isn't interesting enough to get its own episode, but I do think it makes a nice pairing with arduous, because if you're doing something arduous, you'll probably want to take a brief respite at some point to gather your strength. Okay, up next we have some examples for how arduous might appear in ordinary conversation or writing. Example number 1. Unloading sacks of grain from trucks onto feed store shelves was arduous, backbreaking labor, but Benji appreciated that at least it wasn't mentally challenging, so he could listen to a lot of fun, true crime podcasts as he worked. Example number 2 comes from Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes. Quote, it appears to me, gentle sir, that your worship's discourse is intended to persuade me that there never were any knights-errant in the world, and that all the books of chivalry are false, lying, mischievous, and useless, and that I have done wrong in reading them, and worse in believing them, and still worse in imitating them, when I undertook to follow the arduous calling of knight-errantry which they set forth, unquote. And knight-errantry, by the way, just a fancier term for the pursuit of being a knight. Example number 3 comes from The Adventures of Captain Bonneville, USA in the Rocky Mountains by Washington Irving. Quote, it was severe and arduous traveling. The plains were swept by keen and bitter blasts of wintry wind. The ground was generally covered with snow. Game was scarce, so that hunger generally prevailed in the camp, while the want of pasturage soon began to manifest itself in the declining vigor of the horses, unquote. Okay, that'll do it for those examples, which brings us to the second word on the docket today, the adjective Herculean. This is a natural pairing with arduous, as it refers to extremely difficult and laborious tasks, or as Google has it, quote, requiring great strength or effort, unquote. So basically just like arduous, only more so. The etymology of this word is where all the fun is, and helps illustrate just how much effort Herculean tasks imply. The word's root is a name, Hercules, a demigod of Greek mythology, who earned renown from his successful completion of the so-called 12 labors. These included killing a lion with a hide so tough no weapon could pierce it, dispatching a 9-headed snake monster called the Hydra that would grow 2 more heads for each one you lopped off, then capturing a bear, cleaning a king's massive animal stables in a single day, for which Hercules cleverly diverted a river to run through the stables, killing some evil birds that could shoot their feathers at you like arrows, then back to capturing both a fierce bull and a bunch of man-eating horses, and a few more labors for good measure. Most of these labors required some combination of superhuman strength and endurance and divine intervention, as Hercules had some friends amongst the Greek deities who'd lend him a hand now and again. The point is, if you call something Herculean, you're saying this is a task of seemingly insurmountable difficulty, such that it would take one such as Hercules to accomplish it. These tasks need not only be physical, by the way, they could be mental or psychological as well. Like, you've probably heard of the famous potato chip slogan, "Bet you can't eat just one," which has the clever marketing subtext that they're so delicious you won't be able to resist once you've had a taste. Well, the fine folks at Lay's could instead have said, eating just one would be a Herculean feat. Hercules himself would probably lack the discipline needed to abstain, and he'd snarf down the whole bag. Alright, now for a couple examples of how to use Herculean in ordinary conversation or writing. Example number 1. Terry was greatly looking forward to relaxing in his new hammock with a good book and a glass of cold lemonade. But first, he faced the Herculean job of assembling that hammock all by himself. Example number 2 is from 3 Men in a Boat by Jerome K. Jerome. Quote, camping out in rainy weather is not pleasant. It is evening. You are wet through, and there is a good 2 inches of water in the boat, and all the things are damp. You find a place on the banks that is not quite so puddly as the other places you have seen, and you land and lug out the tent, and 2 of you proceed to fix it. It is soaked and heavy, and it flops about, and tumbles down on you, and clings round your head and makes you mad. The rain is pouring steadily down all the time. It is difficult enough to fix a tent in dry weather. In wet, the task becomes Herculean. And finally, example number 3 comes from The Mysterious Affair at Styles by Agatha Christie. Quote, "It occurred to me very forcibly at that moment that to harbor Miss Howard and Alfred Inglethorpe under the same roof and keep the peace between them was likely to prove a Herculean task, and I did not envy John. I could see by the expression of his face that he fully appreciated the difficulty of the position. For the moment, he sought refuge in retreat, and left the room precipitately," which means like suddenly or immediately, unquote. Okay, folks, that'll do it for the second round of examples and for today's show. And may I say, it's been an arduous, nay, Herculean feat putting it all together. Really, I bet if Hercules had been assigned to do something as difficult as making a podcast episode, he'd have said, "Please no, spare me. Couldn't I battle another deadly mythical beast instead?" Despite all the effort, though, if you folks enjoyed this episode, well, it was all worth it. On behalf of everyone here in work at the show, this is your host, Jamie Silva, saying so long. We hope you get a respite from your arduous labors sometime soon. And as always, we hope you have a great one.